And you're very welcome back. And that was the sound of Dolores Keane's and Tommy Sands and Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Song that was written back in the 60s, I suppose, protesting against the war in Vietnam that Americans fought in from about 1964 to about 1973, and hundreds of thousands were killed. And tonight we are reviewing The Woman, written by Kristin Hannah, that is set in Vietnam, and it tells the story of Frankie McGrath, who goes off to nurse there. And joining me in the studio tonight, I've got Tina Garry and Louise Flannagan. Just a mental block there. Ladies, you are very welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
So, Tina, just give us a wee rundown on the storyline there.
So it's an epic tale. It's about Frances McGrath, who her family call her Frankie, and she decides on a whim that she's going to go out and do service in Vietnam. She's from a very cushy, well-heeled background. There's a lot of kind of parallels between their family and the Kennedys. You know, she has everything she could possibly want, but she feels that there's something else out there for her. Their expectations for young women in those days were that, especially for someone like Frankie, that she would marry well like her mother, and that there would be a path laid out for her. And then her brother goes to Vietnam, and her brother's friend makes a flippant remark that women can be heroes too. And in her naivety, she thinks that this is her calling, that she needs to go to Vietnam as well. But she's very comforted and very lacking in life experience, and she soon realises that it's not going to be an easy experience for her. Does it without her parents' knowledge. She loses her brother in Vietnam as well, so they're horrified at the prospect of her going, and we realise he has passed on page 20, so we're plunged into her grief and to her journey really, really soon in the novel. And then it's a case where she decides as soon as she arrives that, you know, I can't do this, I'm not cut out for this. And it's a hellish first section of the book. The book's in two different parts, and it's punctuated then by her letters home and by her letters from her parents to her. But it's an epic tale. It's very gritty, it's very detailed, and true to form with Kristin Hannah. It's very emotionally charged as well, so it really does grip you, and the historical accuracy with it as well is really gripping. I was saying to Louise earlier, I found myself slipping off to bed 7:30, 8 o'clock just to get back into it. You know, it really, you're hooked incredibly quickly, and then it unleashes between there. The novel title, The Women, is basically about friendships that she makes when she's in Vietnam, and the sisterhood or the structural friendship that she has that keeps her from falling apart all of the times that she nearly falls apart whenever she eventually comes home.
Mm-hmm. And you were saying about her development as a person. When she went off to Vietnam, she was very, very naive, and when she came back, I suppose, like she went as a virginal 21-year-old. She came back a woman of the world, an established surgical nurse. And did you find, Louise, that was handled well by Kristin, her development of her character?
I think it was, yeah. Like as you said at the start of the story, she is very, very naive, and she has always had such a sheltered life. And Tina mentioned, that her long-term expectation for her own life is to marry and to have kids, and then she just gets this mad notion, I suppose, to go off and nurse. And at the start, like, she is just so naive. She doesn't know what she's getting into when she's so young as well. And like when she arrives in Vietnam, she's just thrown into the deep end. There's a mass casualty situation, and she doesn't know what to do. She pretty much freezes. She's like a rabbit in the headlights. And after I thought her first encounter in the ER situation, I think it's like her boss basically says to her, "Oh, I heard you were as useful as a tiara in there," so, which I thought was kind of a funny turn of phrase. So she goes from kind of being, totally out of her depth, to finding her feet and to being, a lifesaver. She literally saves lives over there, and she does become, very much, self-assured and confident. So when she goes back, as you say, she is a very different person. So you do see that transition and the progress of her character from being very, very naive and very unsure of herself, to being very, very competent and very relied on and very much respected by her peers in the army. But then, of course, when she goes home, she's like a scourge in society, and it's about, I suppose, her struggle then of, feeling confident and feeling proud of herself, and then being exposed to so much animosity and disrespect. Like, she literally gets spat on by several people when she comes home, and she's quite confused by this, because I suppose when they're over there, they're quite sheltered from the reality of how people feel about the war. There's a sense for a while that it's the hippies, that have a problem with the war. And some of the remarks, especially from her family, they're very highbrow. They'd be quite disparaging, the Earl hippies, what would they know type thing. But then, of course, the anti-war movement becomes much more widespread, and of course eventually encompasses the veterans themselves, in the efforts to try to stop the war. So you see that entire span of her going off being so naive and so out of her depth, to experiencing every step of that process, towards the memorial and the eventual acceptance in America of the atrocity and the loss of life and the devastation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the social realism element to it is quite clever. It is it's historical fiction as well as being, a wonderful piece of fiction at the same time. It's historically very accurate, and the representation of women in it, and the change in expectations in society of what women were supposed to do, and then Frankie goes down her own path, and then coming back and trying to reconcile what her peers did with their lives in comparison to what she's done with hers. She's fixed all of these people in Vietnam, but she's returned utterly broken. And it's just about, the expectations on women. Even there was a point where in her family home there was a hero wall where all of the men who had, done service or who had been in the military had their pictures on the wall, where the females in the family, their wedding pictures were on the wall. And when Frankie's father doesn't really recognise that she was one of the 11,000 women that did go to Vietnam, she can't understand why she's not getting the same honour, the same adulation as any other relative in the family would have gotten. And the horrible irony about that is that Frankie's father herself didn't serve through some kind of technicality. He didn't have to, and she's really bitter that she gave up so much of her life and so much of her time to do 2 terms of service out there, but he still won't put her picture up on the wall because she's not doing what was expected of her, what she didn't do. She was told she wasn't following the path that had been set out for her. So it's it's epic. It really is.
And I suppose it really, she deals a lot with relationships, and what's very strong throughout the book is her relationship with her father, and she really wants to get his just his love and affection, and she wants to make him proud of her. And it has her going to Vietnam, she thought she was going to do that, but it had the completely opposite result.
Yeah, definitely. One of the recurrent threads in the novel is that female trauma is not validated, and her father never validates hers and never validates her service either. And there's this kind of, where's my recognition? And I suppose that's just symbolic of the other almost 11,000 women who had been in the same position. And as Louise had said, Hannah's very clever in her way that the novel kind of follows the journey of those women of gaining that recognition nearer the conclusion of the novel.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose there are a lot of relationships, Louise. There's a relationship with her parents, with her mother as well, and then her female friends, Barb and Ethel, and they become very close to her.
Yeah, so Barb and Ethel are 2 nurses who are there a little bit before her, so they're kind of used to the situation and the trauma when she arrives. So when she first arrives, she basically she works and then she just crawls into her bed because she's exhausted. And Barb and Ethel kind of pull her out of herself, and they encourage her to live while she's there as well. And when you're reading it, there was a part of me I could hardly believe it, but they did smile and they did laugh and they did drink and they did dance and they did have a good time. But obviously they deserved that and they needed that, because it was kind of the only thing that could keep them on an even keel. But one of the first parties that Barb and Ethel bring her to, Frankie can hear bombs dropping in the background, and like the drinks are shaking and everything just with the impact. And she's obviously, you know, really freaked out and thinks, you know, we need to go to seek shelter. And they say, no, you know, just dance, just try and switch off. This is as good as it gets, essentially. So they play a really, really important role in her enjoyment of a really terrible, terrible situation. You know, there's a sense that they're all in it together, but that they really, really help each other to kind of get through and to see the good in what they can, you know, and I suppose in some instances to make the most of it. You know, as when she's an older character, you know, Frankie looks back, you know, to her time in Vietnam to say that it was the worst memories but also the best memories of her life, and those best memories are largely to do with Barb and Ethel. They have a huge role to play. Like there's a sense that they just understand the depths of each other's hearts and minds, and so much doesn't even need to be said between them. They would take one look at her and they would know what she needed, you know, if she needed a drink or if she needed a walk or if she needed advice, you know, that they just kind of instinctively, much more than the men in the story, knew what they needed, you know, what each of them needed at any given moment of time.
Mm-hmm. And I think I've read a number of Kristin's books, and I always found that her descriptive technique was really good. You could feel yourself being in the hospital or in the jungle or on the helicopter. Did you find that, Tina?
I thought it was very well written, really vivid, well paced. But like within 20 pages, I was like, okay, I have to put the book down. I didn't want to. I was like, okay, I'll do a few more. Narrative structure is brilliant. There's a section of the novel, a very large section of the novel that is set in Vietnam. There's another section that's not. I was surprised when the Vietnam section finished, and it was like, and I looked, and there was quite a lot left, and it was like, oh, and I thought historical fiction, it's going to be a book about her experience in Vietnam. Quite a large chunk of the book is about her experience post-Vietnam and her struggles with that. So it is very well paced, as I'd said already. The letters home punctuate the kind of experience, and the letters, home to Barb and Ethel after they finish their service, and their correspondence with each other sometimes can give an awful lot of way in what's not said. Frankie's correspondence and communication with her parents is all very, hi, is everyone, everything here is fine, we work, things are busy, but she never goes into the true horror, the true detail. They're very much shielded from it in a way, growing up, that she was shielded from maybe a lot of realities of life as well. And when her and Barb and Ethel become, this really tight-knit group, ordinarily, had they not been in Vietnam, their backgrounds were as such that they would never have met. They would never have been in the same social circles. They would never have ordinarily undergone anything similar to each other. But Vietnam brings them together, and they share this, unbreakable bond, irrespective of their differences in background or differences in outlook. And they remain friends throughout their whole life, and they very much save each other and are there for each other for the rest of their lives. I think they maybe deal with things a little bit better than Frankie does. Yeah. Frankie really struggles when she comes home. Yeah. And the women are her saving grace, and they return at different stages in her life to pick up the pieces, and there's a lot of those stages and there's a lot of pieces.
Now Frankie does make the point, herself, when she's talking to someone and she's trying to work through her post-traumatic stress, and she makes that observation herself that her friends are seemingly coping with it so much better than her. And one of the characters says, war trauma isn't a competitive sport, which I thought was like a great turn of phrase, to, I suppose, to justify or to explain, like, that, everyone's coping skills are different. And, like, there were times when I found I couldn't quite warm to Frankie's character as much as I wanted to at times. But I kind of was thinking about it, for the purposes of discussing it. And I think that might have been intentional on the part of the author. Like, she is just a ball of enigma. She's a mystery. I don't even think she truly understands herself. So how could we as readers truly understand her as a character? So I think I found it quite difficult in some instances to relate to her, or, to fully engage with her. But I think that was intentional.
Yeah, it's hard to understand why someone like Frankie would ever have signed up for Vietnam. She was the only person in her locality that had served, the only female, in contrast to Barb's hometown, where everyone had signed up to serve because they didn't have the social opportunities or the opportunities for further education that Frankie would have automatically just been afforded. You know, so it's
just kind of want to shake her sometimes.
Yeah, you know, but like the likes of Barb was able to adapt because she'd struggled all her life and she was used to the struggle, and Frankie didn't. So yeah.
And I thought, you know, her research was so good because like I taught this module whenever I taught history to Leaving Cert, and her description of the whole Vietnam War I thought was so accurate, and how she researched the post-traumatic stress that Frankie suffered after coming back, and it's the very subtle description too of blacks in America and how at that time they were second-class citizens. I thought her research was very, very good. Tina?
It's meticulously researched and very detailed, and when you read all the thank yous at the back, you know, it is true to form a piece of historical fiction, you know, and it brought so much back that maybe I'd forgotten it happened, you know, even down to the whole fake news element, which we forget maybe just isn't something off the Trump era, you know, where what was being told at home through the media and through the newspapers, what public information was given was very different to how real life was in Vietnam. And then when these veterans returned home, they just couldn't get over why they wouldn't be afforded sympathy, or why they weren't given a hero's welcome, you know, why everything was so poor. So it was, and I suppose that was a feature of World War II as well, but it's just a case where the media had entirely led the American public astray, and they weren't grateful for the sacrifice of so many young men and women. To quote that Paul Hardcastle song, I'm showing my age now, Jean. What was the average age of the death of the young men in America at the time? 19?
Yeah, 18, 19.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a very, very well researched, very detailed, very true to form, and just very much gripping. You would wonder, in the way that Firefly Lane has already been serialised, would this be picked up as well? And certainly, and I
think it is actually.
In its scope, it's vast enough, and it has the emotional depth as well.
Likes and dislikes, Louise?
Oh Lord, I did like the overall story, but I've like as a genre, I'm not really sure if war stories are my thing. I found some of it, you know, difficult to read. I suppose, like most people, I'm anti-war. I don't understand. Yeah, I don't understand why anybody would head off to war as Frankie did. But again, obviously, cultural context and all the rest. So I found it difficult to read. It's very descriptive and it's graphic, but it is what it says in the tin. Like, you know, it's a nurse in Vietnam, so obviously it's going to be quite graphic. I found that difficult at times, so to read. Like, I was heading over to Edinburgh to visit two of my friends, and I was in the airport by myself. So I was like, right, I'll sit now and I'll have a wee burger and I'll read another couple of pages of the book. So I started reading anyway, and I was just chewing the burger, and there was a part about an amputation of a hand because gangrene had set in, and I was like, right, I'll eat first and then I'll carry on reading. So, you know, it is, but now she doesn't sensationalise it. She doesn't kind of make it all gory, and, you know, it just is what it is. It's a very traumatic situation, and that is depicted very accurately. But it's difficult to read at times, you know, so that would be something that I found a little bit unsettling.
Likes, dislikes, Tina?
I like the fact that you were quickly hooked. Maybe the first 80%, 90% of the novel, it's paced really well. It has really relatable characters. It has a lovely storyline. It's, if you like a good cry, it's a really poignant, emotionally charged novel. My dislike was there were times where I was kind of checking how much was left, how many pages were left, and it was like, surely nothing else can go wrong. And it kind of gets to the stage where it's trauma after trauma after trauma, and it's like, Frankie, pull yourself together here, because if these three friends existed in real life, at one point they're going to say, no, it's time for you it's time for you to pull yourself together. I kind of felt as if we could have just maybe had one trauma less towards the end, because I felt maybe the last 20% dragged a small bit for me. It's full of romance. It's a great read, but just towards the end it was like, Now, come on, wrap it up, Kristin. Let's go.
Out of 10, we never even got talking about the 4 romances she had, but we'll let the readers find that out themselves. Out of 10, what
I'm going to go for an 8 on this one.
8 as well.
8, and I'd give it a 9 because I do love her. It's not my favourite book of hers. I think The Nightingale was my favourite book. I've read about 5 of her books. The Nightingale was my favourite. But anyway, as I said, would recommend it to the listeners tonight to go out and buy it. And I think it has been made into a film as well. So Tina and Louise, thank you so much for joining me tonight, and hopefully we'll get you back again sometime.
Thank you.
Visit Inishowen Co-op Home Build Show at Inishowen Gateway Hotel, Buncrana on Saturday, April 13th, 11